most of you know, or many of you know, he's written and published 17 million books that are all around the world. So sold. Yeah. Sold. Okay. Okay. All right. So, I mean, I think for myself, I'll just speak for myself for a minute, but the thing about Philip is just from the start, I think God's made him a great communicator. And he learned how to communicate in Campus Life magazine. And then he started writing books, and he just is able to communicate to a very wide audience of people about his spiritual life. And what's cool is basically the things that he writes about are the things he's experiencing in his spiritual life. And that's why so many of us can relate to so many things that he writes about. His books, like about disappointment with God, prayer, about answering prayer. A lot of the topics that you may or may not have read are all things that we all kind of think about from now. And then just recently, he's finished his memoirs, which basically informed all of us clearly about the first 20 years of his life. And it's quite an amazing book. And he brought a bunch, and we're going to sell them for $10 tonight, which is a great thing. Yeah. And he will sign the books if you want to get it signed. He'll sign it here tonight too. So Philip's going to talk, and then he'll probably go into a time of questions. So as you're listening, think if there's anything that you kind of want him to pursue further or talk about. So thanks, Philip.
For example, the book starts with a true story that determined my whole life. My father, I was only a year old, my father was in an iron lung with polio, and a group of Christians became convinced that he would be healed. So they had him removed from the iron lung against all medical advice, and he wasn't healed, he died. And it's not that they were against him, they loved him, they were supporting him, but they thought they spoke for God, and they took a prerogative they didn't have. And I also, growing up in that church, I learned to do the stuff, give the testimonies, pray the prayers, all that. And over time, I didn't know how to tell the fake from the real. I was so good at the fake, I knew how to do it. And then when I really wanted the spiritual experience, I couldn't tell the fake from the real. So those two things made me kind of suspicious, definitely made me reject my faith completely for a time, because I found out that what the church was teaching very blatantly, uglily about racism was wrong. The curse of Ham theory. And if they're wrong about that, maybe they're wrong about the Bible. Maybe they're wrong about Jesus. So you hear people say, oh, I was saved from alcohol. I was saved from drugs. Well, I was saved from the church. The crazy things the church taught me that I found out were wrong. And it set me on this path that I feel very blessed. As a freelance writer, I can write about anything I want. So I usually start with things I don't know. You think a lot of writers write books about things they know. I write a book about things I don't know because it gives me a chance to study and figure out what I think. So if, for instance, I wrote a book on prayer because I didn't know anything about prayer. So, I'll write a book about it. And I've been in that kind of evangelicalese subculture. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is that how does God relate to us? What is God like and what are we like? Because I've struggled with that all my life. And I went to a college where people go around and say, God told me this, God told me that. And alarm bells go off for me because God told the people around my father that he would be healed, and they were wrong. So how do you know? How do you relate to God? And so I was asked to speak one time at a theological society, and I was pretty intimidated because all these guys are PhDs and I'm not ordained. And I made a list of things I figured out, and then another list of things I'm still disturbed by, and then another list of things I have no clue about. So that's what I want to talk about tonight. I made a whole list for them. And I'm just going to talk about kind of that arena of God and us, how we relate to God and what is God really like. And I'm going to start, we had an interesting experience, about a month or so ago. a woman named Jennifer Wiseman, she's a strong Christian, was also head of the space project on the Hubble Space Telescope. She was in charge of all the science experiments. So you had to go through her to get your slot. And she was telling us some of the stories, and they were just about to launch the James Webb Telescope to find out even more. And this is going to be hard to believe, but you just got to believe it, okay? You got to trust me. There was a man, I think it was in the 1980s, right when the Hubble first went up. And this guy had an idea. He said, what if we trained the Hubble telescope every time it circles the Earth to train it to look at this one dark spot? It looks completely empty, like there's nothing there. Deep space, and we'll train it to go as far back as it can go, as it can look. And so for 400 times, every time the Hubble circled, it stopped, but it trained everything on this one tiny little spot about the size of the eye of this needle, okay? And they kept going and they kept going, and then they found ways to make the mirror even more precise. And to everybody's astonishment, they found that in that dark spot, there were 10,000 galaxies. Not solar systems, galaxies. Each one of those galaxies had an average of 100 billion stars. Okay. And if you move it over 1 inch, 10,000 galaxies, 10,000 galaxies, 10,000 galaxies, 10,000 galaxies. They figure there's at least 1 trillion. Many of them we won't see because the universe is expanding so fast. There's not enough time for light to get here because this keeps going away from us. So I keep that in mind. I call it the Hubble Space Telescope view of God. 1 trillion galaxies. And we're this tiny little dot, little pale blue dot in one solar system, medium-sized solar system, and kind of on the edge of one galaxy out of 1 trillion. Wow. So I remember when I was writing the book on prayer, and I often struggle with that. Okay, so if God has 1 trillion galaxies to worry about, how involved is God in our planet? You know, this, God told me this, God told me that. It's a pretty big God we're talking about. I remember when I was a kid, I had an ant farm. None of my pets work out. And this ant farm, you know, had glass or is plastic on 2 sides. And you drop little particles down there, and all the ants, they know exactly what to do. They move the particles around. And every time I tried to help them, I would accidentally kill a few of them, you know, because. And then I got a tropical aquarium, saltwater fish, very expensive fish. And I kept them for years, and I fed them every day. Their entire source of food came from outside, from me. And so I would get them this exotic shrimp. And every time I fed them, you know what they did? They ran and hid behind shells. I could never get them to like me. They never knew that I was a good guy. They thought I was something to fear. And maybe it's something like that. Maybe it's healthy every once in a while to step back and realize who we're dealing with in God. One of my first trips to Breckenridge, we were living in Chicago at the time, and I wanted to start a book, and it ended up being the book Disappointment with God. And I came here for 2 weeks. I packed a whole suitcase full of books, and one of them was the Bible. And my puzzle was, why is it that God sometimes intervenes dramatically and then sometimes doesn't? So you got the 10 plagues of Egypt and the Red Sea, and then all those daily miracles of the Israelites, where the pillar of fire, the pillar of cloud, they are eating breakfast thanks to a miracle, everyday manna. But then it says, for 430 years before that, there was no word from the Lord. There was no sign of God. So what causes these pulses? And I was very puzzled. So I decided to go through the Bible, and I started, computers were brand new. I had this funny little laptop that didn't work very well at altitude because the screen was kind of squishy. And I started a word search on the word God. And it got pretty tedious because it's in there a lot, actually, in the Bible. So I decided, okay, forget this word search. I'll just read the whole Bible. And so I did. I read it in a 2-week period. That's all I did. Just read through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. I didn't open any of the other books. It snowed every day, but where I was, the driveway couldn't get plowed, so I couldn't go skiing. All I could do was read the Bible. And I got I got a different kind of view of the Bible. I had done an edition of the Bible called the Student Bible, where I got the verse by verse real close up thing. And this was like a 30,000 foot view. And it made me think a lot about what was behind creation, especially what was behind the creation of human beings. What is God up to? And it also helped me understand the Trinity for the first time. Have you ever tried to explain the Trinity to a Muslim or a Jewish person or a 5-year-old? It's hard. Well, here's my understanding. It's a 3-act play. And like most mysteries, you don't understand what's going on until the very end. And then looking back, it makes sense. So in the Bible, the first act is clearly God the Father. That's the Hubble Space Telescope God, who can do anything, who can, if you get close to him, you're going to be in a body bag. You're going to get scorch marks. The Mount Sinai is glowing and spewing volcano, and only Moses can go up there, and everybody else is scared and they fall away dead. So that God, there were no Jewish atheists, Israelite atheists in those days. If you doubted God, you just walk up to Mount Sinai and touch it, and for 1 nanosecond, you will believe in God. And that's very powerful. It's very awesome. Interestingly, the time in the Bible when there were the most direct interventions, miracle after miracle after miracle, is the time of least faith. We look back on the time of the Israelites, while Moses is up in this mountain glowing and smoking, and there's a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud and manna on the ground. While he's up there, what are they doing? Making a golden idol, a golden calf. It almost creates the opposite. I mean, go figure, but read it all the way through. The same is true in the prophets and other places. So then the second act is Jesus. And that's hard to swallow. The God, the Hubble Space Telescope God, the God who is bigger than 1 trillion galaxies, becoming a fetus, on that tiny little planet, one of 100 billion in our galaxy, one of 1 trillion galaxies. I mean, can you believe that? Well, the people around Jesus, many of them didn't. They crucified him for claiming to be that God. You've seen me, you've seen the Father, he said. He's the exact image of God, but he didn't match up with what they were expecting from the Old Testament Act 1 view of God. But Jesus came to show us what God is like, to show us what we should be like. So he became one of us 2-legged little people on this one planet that isn't working out according to design. And then Jesus was only around for 3 years. He didn't do anything for North America. He didn't do anything for Europe, didn't do anything for Asia. He just, a few thousand people in this one tiny little corner of the Roman Empire. And then he said, okay, that's it. I've done my work. It's finished. It's up to you. It's actually for your good that I'm going away. And then he leaves, and the disciples are all standing there looking up into the sky. Where'd he go? Where'd he go? And the angels show up and say, why are you staring into the sky? Didn't he tell you to get moving? So that's Act 3. Act 1 is God the Father, bombastic, scary, awesome, unbelievable, unbelievably awesome. Act 2, very different. You could shake hands with Jesus. You could argue with him. You could talk to him. You could crucify him. Very different, very different. So different that the Jews said, this doesn't add up. That's not the God. They don't even say his name. You can't crucify that God. Put that together. And then Act 3 is us, the Spirit living in us. And I noticed several things about that paradigm, that pattern. One is that it seems that God has been withdrawing. Okay, because if you read Genesis, Exodus, those early books, God's always there. Adam sins, God shows up. Cain sins, God shows up. Tower of Babel, God shows up in person, Noah. He's micromanaging this tiny little planet. So he's always there. And there aren't any atheists because God's there, proves himself. But nobody can get close to him. When Moses is the only one who can go into this tent of meeting, and he goes into this tent, when he comes out, he's glowing. And people say, put something over your face. One of these Breckenridge face masks, you're glowing. So you can't get close to that God. And then Jesus comes and you can get much closer. You could camp out with him. You can go fishing with him. You can have a prayer meeting with him. But he's not scary. And in fact, the miracles change too. They're not zap you type miracles. They're healing type miracles. They're compassion type miracles. And then he says, okay, the reason I came was to show you the way. And now I've got to go because if I don't go, the Spirit won't come. And actually God is Spirit. So you've got this withdrawal of God doing it directly to Jesus, to gradually turning it over first to Jesus and then to us. Now go and be my disciples. And the other thing that happens though, an apparent withdrawal, but actually an increase in intimacy. Very few people felt intimate with God, the Father, in Act 1. People did in Act 2, the disciples, not that many. But now, any of us can. And in fact, the Bible's pretty clear. That is what the human experiment was all about from the beginning. It wasn't about, hey, look what God can do. God already knows what God can do. He doesn't have to prove anything. It's about, I wonder what they can do. I wonder if I create people with intelligence in this tiny little planet, will they love me? Will they worship me? And there's a lot in the Old Testament, that's the gamble that Satan poses to Job. They only love you when you're nice to them. They won't love you if you take things away. And this seems important to God to be loved. And it's pretty clear. John tells us God is love. He doesn't say God loves. He said God is love. It's a noun. He's nothing but love. That's his essence. But to love, you have to have something to love. And the images that we see again and again in the Bible, God talks about us as his children and us as his bride. Those are the most intimate relationships we know. Those are the images that God uses. But you see, God isn't a body. God is a spirit. And a lot of people I grew up around want God to act like the God the Father of the Old Testament. And so they pray for a parking place, or they pray to find a lost object. And maybe they have more faith than I do. I don't know. Often it doesn't work for me. I still have a lot of lost things. And I know there are three things that God never answers prayers. One is the weather. One is something you lose on your computer. Kiss it goodbye. And another is golf. Those three things. God never answers those prayers. But I think all of human history really is a dance between the Hubble Space Telescope God trying to find a way to relate to the little ants in the ant farm down here without either kind of obliterating them and we keep wanting God to act like that God, and God doesn't have anything to prove, and God is invisible, and God is a spirit. So the way we relate to God is through spiritual disciplines. It's on God's terms. It's not on our terms. And again, if you go back and read the Old Testament, if you do it on our terms, kind of, so the God is very obvious all the time. Funny thing, it didn't create faith. It created the opposite of faith. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So why did God come up with this experiment? And I don't know if he created all trillion galaxies just for us to be one planet or around one star in one of them. I don't know. There may be a lot of other experiments going on. But I think it's pretty clear if you read the Bible that the human experiment is because God wanted beings he could relate to and love. And it's when Jesus was here, Jesus was one of us, okay? And the Act 1 God, the Hubble telescope God, actually spoke 4 times in the Gospels. And people could hear it. The Greeks thought it was thunder. The disciples, what did he say? What did he say? Do you know what he said? He said the same thing every time. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. He gives me pleasure. And I think that's a really important clue into what he wants from us. He wants to be able to say at the end of a day, that's my beloved son, daughter. He gave me pleasure today. Giving God pleasure. You have these, some of you were raised Presbyterian, Westminster Confession. What is the whole duty of man, or the chief end of man? How does it go? What's the answer? Very good. To glorify God and enjoy him forever. But that doesn't tell you what's in it for God, right? It tells us what's in it for us. What's in it for God is that he gets pleasure out of us doing that, glorifying God and enjoying him forever. This is my beloved son, daughter, in whom I'm well pleased. This direct intervention, even in Jesus, one of the most spectacular miracles he did was the raising of Lazarus. And everybody knew Lazarus was dead. He'd been locked in a tomb. They were afraid that he would smell bad. So no one questioned that it was a trick. And then he came out, had to unwrap his clothes, and there he is, right in front of them. So what did they do? Did they all become followers of Jesus? Read the account in John 11. No, they decided we got to get rid of this guy. We got to kill him. He's a threat to the order. He's a threat to the institution. So John says that was really when the Pharisees decided we got to snuff him. Got to get him out of here. Really interesting. If we think if God would just do a miracle so that everybody in the world could see it, then they would believe. Well, I don't think so. Actually, the opposite. It's a funny thing. The way people believe, and I think this is behind the experiment, is when we, the body of Christ, act like Jesus. When we care for the poor, when we reach out to people who don't deserve it, when we love our enemies, when we do things that are unnatural, when we're a sign of contradiction to our celebrity, success, entertainment-oriented society. That makes people say, maybe there's something more to life than sitting with a glass of wine watching my 964 cable television channels. Okay. But I'm still disturbed. Those are things I think I figured out. I think I figured out a little bit of why God would dabble and end up with planet Earth, and why we're here. And in the process, I've learned about how God is not the person that I grew up with. That God is a God of love and of grace and of mercy. And there's a great phrase from William Ramsey, who was an Anglican bishop in England. And he said, in God, there is no un-Christ-likeness at all, which is a real fancy way of saying, if you want to know what God is really like, look at Jesus. That's what God is like. Okay, I buy that. But it still disturbs me, because when I read the Old Testament, there's a lot of un-Christ-likeness behavior that's ascribed to God. And so I'm still trying to figure out some of that stuff out. And in the book of Revelation, there's a picture of Jesus with blood up to the shoulders of the horses, and it doesn't match the Jesus I know in the Gospels. So there's some stuff that really still bothers me and disturbs me. But I like what I know about Jesus. I'm not sure Revelation would be in the Bible, but I didn't say that. Cut it. All right. I've written a lot about pain. John mentioned that was my first book. And so I started there. It was a huge barrier to my faith. And one way to solve the problem of pain, why God doesn't intervene, is to say that God never intervenes. He just, the deistic approach, he wound it up like a clock and lets it go. So then you don't have to worry about why did this person get healed, but not my father? You know, why did this person have a child, 3-year-old with leukemia, but not the person next door, not my daughter? You don't have to ask those questions because it's just the way the world is. God set it up, and some good, some bad, and it just keeps going. As soon as God intervenes at all, then it really complicates things. Why did God intervene here and not there? I used to get up and say, there are some things for which there has never been a recorded miracle. And one would be pancreatic cancer. There were no recorded cases of pancreatic cancer being healed and gone away. And then one of my very best friends who lives in Chicago had stage 4 liver and pancreatic cancer and tried a whole bunch of things and gave up. And 6 months later, she went to a healing and prayer conference and was prayed for. And 9 years out, there's not a living cancer cell in her body. Was she healed? Well, she would say yes. And doctors have no explanation. The University of Chicago asked her to start a healing prayer ministry at the University of Chicago Hospital. Okay, but what about all those other people? As soon as you let God, I almost would rather nobody got healed, because I could cope with that a little more than just the capriciousness. Yeah. So we want God to intervene. I mean, why doesn't God put Vladimir Putin gently to sleep tonight so that he doesn't wake up tomorrow? You know, why didn't God, imagine being a Jew in a concentration camp in 1945 and praying, and 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million of your brother and sister die. Why doesn't God? And that's when I struggle about the parking place prayers. You know, they're cute, they're nice. Yeah, and I pray them too. Janet used to run a senior citizens deal, and they got free meat from a grocery store. She could never find a parking place in Chicago, so she'd pull in and pray. She'd come out, there's a ticket on almost every time. That's not right. Life isn't fair. So, how do I reconcile the cosmic view of God, the Hubble Space Telescope view of God, with the biblical viewpoint that says our little tiny choices have eternal, even cosmic consequences? Our responses, do they really matter that much? And you could put a real heavy duty burden on your kids, you know. Do you realize what will happen if you have sex before marriage? And then they grow up and they think, wait a minute, God has 1 trillion galaxies? Do you think he really cares whether I have sex before marriage? And, you know, we play games like that. I don't know how to resolve that. The other thing is when Jesus said, it's actually for your good that I'm going away. Whoa. Man, wouldn't it be better if he had stayed behind? If we have Pope Jesus, wouldn't it be better if he had just stayed? So that, look at the mess that the church has made in history. And look at the questions going on now, same-sex marriage and racism and all this kind of stuff. Wouldn't it be great if we could just call Jesus up in Rome and say, okay, what's the answer here? What should be our policy? But God always moves toward freedom, moves toward delegation, giving it away. And the church sometimes does it well and sometimes does not do it well. I happen to grow up in a church that didn't do it well at all. And there are a lot of people like that. I'm sure you've seen the stats on the next generation and how many of them, 50% of them who were raised in evangelical churches will ditch the whole thing by the time they're in college. How could it be good? And I'll give you two more things that I have no clue about, okay? You can take them away, and then I'll just open it up for questions or your comments. There are these great Christian philosophers, and they really are. Alvin Plantinga is one of them. And they will say, the reason that this world is screwed up is because God created free human beings. And if you create free human beings in a universe of fixed laws, they will inevitably make wrong choices. And if you made them unfree, then maybe they'd be like angels and always do the right things, but they wouldn't really be free. They would just be robots. So if you give them freedom, they may figure out, like Cain did, the first generation after creation, hey, I could kill my brother if I don't like him. And there it starts. Okay, so is it possible to have a world where people are free and yet they freely make the right decision all the time? And the philosophers would say, no, that's not possible. But isn't that what we believe about the afterlife? Like in heaven, that we'll make the right decisions, nobody will force us, and yet, isn't that what we believe? So if God's going to do it at some point down the road, why didn't he just start there? I don't know. I have no clue. And here's another one. Our belief structure is based upon creation, fall, redemption, restoration. You hear that over and over. God created, there was this human fall, and then redemption happened through Jesus, and God will eventually restore. That's not news to you, right? You hear that. That's kind of our whole belief. And it is. It's all the way through the Bible. But it doesn't match up at all with the scientific record. There's no, if you look at the fossil record, it's from the very beginning, it's from simplicity to complexity. And at every stage, there's death and violence. There's no indication that there was ever a perfect place, a perfect Garden of Eden. And then the whole thing started falling apart. Actually, it looks like just the opposite. So either you reinterpret some of the Bible stories or you deny the science. How do you put those two together? I don't know. I've got no clue. So maybe you have the answer to those. And I'll turn it over to you and let you either comment or ask questions or talk about your own things that you struggle with. Love to hear those. Because this was presented to me as we all go through this process of deconstructing and then reconstructing faith. And we do. And I've spent a whole career doing that because my faith badly needed reconstructing from the church I grew up in. And I've been fortunate to be able to do that in public and make a living at it. I just pick one topic after another and work it through. So maybe one day I'll figure these out and then I can write a book about it. Or I should write a book before I figure them out. It'll give me a chance. So any reactions or some of your own? Yes.
It's a question about anything that you talked about, but let's start with, since you started with interstellar basis, now telescope. As you may know, science is puzzled about one thing, especially science that anchors itself from a Big Bang theory. And the Big Bang theory does not explain what they have now discovered, and Hubble has helped in that regard, which is that the universe is expanding at an accelerating rate. That means that there has to be an energy force expanding it, because that doesn't meet any law of science that they normally relate to. And so what they have claimed, and they're trying to identify something called dark matter. And it's something that is an energy force that is continuing to expand the inner, the universe. And they're trying to understand what that force is. I'm not sure exactly what my question is, except that this is very interesting because a number of Christians have tried to camp, well, that's God. That's God, it's His creation, maybe that's His Holy Spirit, or whatever. So I will formulate this into maybe a twofold question as I'm talking about this. So one, do you have any thoughts about that, first of all? And second of all, I know that you didn't camp on necessarily, but maybe you touched on the possibility of many other blue planets like our blue planet, i.e. life, and maybe life as we know it. And then historically, that would disturb a lot of Christianity enough that no, God, Jesus came, died just for this planet. There can't be any other life. But is there a possibility? Are you open to that? Does your theology allow that? That there could be many planets and many humanoids and many creations that God is also trying to relate to in one way or another.
Yeah. Did you get that? The question was about dark matter and the Big Bang and life on other planets. Dark matter, I have no clue about, but the Big Bang really has only come to be believed in my lifetime. It's a pretty recent theory, and most credible astronomers in the day it was first proposed were really against it because it looks too theistic. You know, it looks like there was someone starting something that just kept going. And they didn't want it to be true. So if you go back and read the literature at the time, they just scoffed at people who were proposing this. And then Edwin Hubble was one of those who proved other galaxies, and eventually everybody accepts it pretty much now. And you're right, the increase in the expansion of the universe and the speed of the universe is a pretty recent discovery, and doesn't fit the laws, and they don't know what happened. And I was asking Jennifer Weissman, okay, if everything is getting farther and farther and farther and faster and faster and faster, at what point does gravity just kind of give up and everything fly apart? And nobody knows. But this dark matter, they're saying like 80% of the matter in the universe is this undetectable dark matter. You can't shine a light on it because it's dark. And you can't put it in a bottle. It doesn't work like our matter at all, except it affects everything else going on in the universe, and it's very powerful. Stay tuned. Nobody knows at this point. The extraterrestrial intelligence thing, actually, this woman, astronomer, head of the Space Telescope Project, also served on the board of the SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And she said these days, they've pretty much given up trying to contact a potential civilization like we see in the space fiction movies, you know. And the reason is it would take so long to create a civilization that had the ability to communicate with us, or certainly to visit us. There's not enough time. I mean, they would have to be, they're usually millions and millions of light years away. And there are no beings that could live for millions and millions of light years by any standard that we know of. And it would take that for them to get to us. So they're no longer looking for, you know, radio waves and things that show intelligence. They're looking for planets that have similar characteristics so that it's possible that life could form, or at least amino acids and proteins. And there are a lot of planets. I mean, she said almost every astronomer she knows believes there has to be life just because of the numbers. If you've got 1 trillion galaxies, each one of them with 100 billion stars, and the average is that there's 1 planet per star. That's a lot of planets out there. And if life occurred one place, it could occur other places. Of course, you probably know about C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, and That Hideous Strength. He believed there was at least a good potential for life on other planets, and proposed that and kind of painted a picture of what that could look like. Yeah, I'm open to it. I just hope I don't meet them in my lifetime. Yes.
First of all, thank you. This has been great. Thanks so much for coming here and talking tonight. I was wondering, obviously beyond the Bible, what other books that have been super influential for you that you've read ever?
That is such an easy question because I wrote a whole book about that. The favorite book that I've ever worked on is a book called Soul Survivor, which I also wrote in Breckenridge, actually. And it's a book about 13 people who deeply influenced my faith. And they're not all Christians, like Gandhi is in there, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, but about half of them are people that I knew and interviewed. And it's just a collection of people, and they almost all have written books. And at the end of each chapter, I explain which of the books you should read first and where they go. So if you look at that book, Soul Survivor, it'll answer your question. Yes, sir.
So on your list of things you're certain about, things you're wondering about, and things you have no clue about, do those change? Have you seen yourself changing, or do you stay focused on things you know, or always things you know, or do other things like, yeah, I thought I knew that, but now it moves into this category, or maybe I'm still thinking about that, or maybe I don't have a clue about that.
Yeah, they do change. Usually it goes things I thought I had figured out, now I'm not so sure about. And the more I get to know the Bible, the more I'm impressed by it. But the more I realize that it wasn't really written to us, it was written to different people at a different time. And separating that out is tricky. It's really tricky. So like in the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, everything is ascribed to God. God did this. God hardened Pharaoh's hearts. God destroyed the Amalekites. God told us to slaughter all the women and children. You know, I'm not sure God did. I think they believed it. He did, and they recorded it that way, because sometimes there are these other windows. One place it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Another place it says Pharaoh hardened his heart. In another place it says Pharaoh's heart got hardened. So they believed everything that happened was God. And I don't see it that way. In fact, I think God, as I understand it, tries to do less by himself and turn it over to other people. God is a delegator. And so some of it is the way it's portrayed in the Bible. And I started reading in Genesis, now I'm up to Exodus, where chapter after chapter, God's giving these really specific details, blueprints for the tabernacle. And I just wonder, you know, the Hubble Space Telescope God is telling how many cubits of this and that, and what to do with the bent wing of a dove. And I don't know, you know, that's the way it, if you just read it straight, that's the way it comes across, but I'm not sure.
So does that make you question other parts of your faith? Does it make you feel insecure about what you believe? Do you feel okay about this, you know, kind of discovering new things about your faith? Is that something that energizes you, or do you feel like, whoa, wait a minute, something, the foundation of my life has been, some brick of it is falling off, and I have to figure out how to still make it stand?
That's a great way to express it. No, it doesn't threaten my faith. It makes me start with Jesus at the center. So, for example, on pain, and God is no Christ-likeness at all, or as Paul said, Jesus is the exact image of the invisible God, the exact image. Okay, we can't see the invisible God, but we can see Jesus. And Jesus never says it's your fault, or you didn't have enough faith, or you did something wrong, so God is punishing you. He always responds with comfort and healing, never turns down a healing opportunity. And so I start there. That's the primary thing. And when somebody talks about God destroying all the Amalekites, I don't know, but I start with Jesus and branch out from there. And I'm very aware. When I wrote the book Disappointment with God, I said actually the plot of the Bible is God trying to learn how to be a parent. And you can't say that in a theological society, God trying to learn how. But look at it. I mean, God says, it's portrayed as saying, they did things that didn't even enter my mind. This is God speaking to Jeremiah, I think. They did things that didn't even enter my mind, talking about child sacrifice. And then you've got those early chapters where God regrets that he ever created man to begin with. It says it very clearly right before Noah's flood. He was grieved in his heart, regretted that he had ever created humans, regretted the whole trillion galaxies or just Earth, I don't know. So, but that progression he started with one family, which became one nation, and that whole thing was to set up Jesus and the superstructure there, and then it's to be spread to everybody. Things change. There are a lot of rules in Exodus and Deuteronomy on how to treat your slave or mistreat your slave. There are a lot of rules in there, weird rules about women and sex. And most of those we don't adhere to today. Orthodox Jews try to, but we don't. I don't know anybody who keeps all those rules. You know, I'm breaking on by wearing this. It's probably mixed materials. Or as Tony Campolo used to say, every time you play football, you're breaking Deuteronomy because they said, don't touch a pigskin. So the only thing that makes me a little nervous is that if everybody is free to decide what to keep and what to not keep, then it's just chaos. And I don't know where you go, but I sure don't keep all those rules. And I try to make, so we take a couple of them. There's 6 verses in the Bible that may be about same-sex behavior. And that's a huge deal. And whole denominations are splitting over those, the Methodists, the Episcopalians. And isn't that odd? I don't see any there have been denominations that split over slavery. It's not happening now. But once you open it up, you never know where it's going to go. A woman, great.
I was just wondering if you have read Ilia Delio. She is a Roman Catholic sister who's also a scientist, and she is writing what I think is a theology for the 21st century based on the work of Teilhard de Chardin.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she would say, if you don't believe in evolution, you can't know God, because God is an attractive force pulling our world into greater and greater consciousness, and which eventually ends in the Christ point. It's an amazing system, but books like The Secret Life of Trees that talk about how trees cooperate, is a witness to God as an attractive force that wants life and wholeness and love. I was just curious if kind of what your response to her might be.
I have not read her personally. I've read other people who have referred to her. Yeah, I love The Hidden Life of Trees, but I just wonder if they were that smart at communicating why they didn't do a better job in Summit County with the pine beetle, but anyway. That's right. That's right. That's good. But let me mention another author. He's a professor at Wheaton College, John Walton. He's the best author I know from a pretty close to biblical perspective, who writes about the whole evolution thing and the weird stuff in Genesis. And his books usually have the lost world of Genesis, the lost world of fill in the blank. He's written a whole series. But he was very helpful to me in just kind of settling down. You got to choose either or. He says, no, Genesis was not written for that purpose. Here's what it's written for. It makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Elia Delio, D-E-L-I-O. Okay. Yes.
I'm still thinking about your 3-act play.
Okay.
And when you got to Act 3, I thought, oh, good, he's going to explain the Holy Spirit. I just wondered if you have more to talk about the Holy Spirit.
Yes. To me, the Holy Spirit is God set loose. And that's really what Jesus said. He said, unless I go away, I've got this intimate connection with the Father, but that's not the purpose of life on earth. The purpose of life on earth, I'm going to make possible through what happens soon, by crucifixion, resurrection, and then ascension. But then the Spirit will come on you like as it did with tongues of fire, and things changed. The Holy Spirit, the disciples got that intimacy that even Moses didn't have. Moses, you could sit around other people and nobody has to put a veil over their face. We are part of God's presence in the world. That's what the body of Christ means. And many times in the Bible, the phrase is the Spirit of Christ, not just Holy Spirit. It's not something new. It's not something that came out of nowhere. I really see it Chardon-like as a progression from Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. This is the culmination. And if you read Ephesians, Colossians, Paul just falls all over himself. Even angels long to look into these things, he says. You're so like shining stars in the universe. Paul says that. And I'm thinking, not my church, but that's God's view. It really is God's view. And the Holy Spirit is just our accessibility to an invisible God, is what I would say. Not bound by time and space, not bound by material form like Jesus was, but God set loose. More intimate, yeah. It looked like withdrawal, but actually it was actually an increase in intimacy. At the same time, it looked like withdrawal. Right. Yes.
What do you think of the premise? I think I read it there once, but this premise was that this whole life is just practice for the afterlife.
I don't agree. I don't think it's practice for the afterlife. I think it's consequential. I think what we do here matters for what we do here now, as well as, I was raised in a church where the whole thing was to just grit your teeth and try to get through this life so you could cross the Jordan into Beulah land, whatever that is. And everything I see in the Bible is that our choices here matter to the universe. Isn't that the story of Job? Job is a beautiful capsule picture of what I've been talking about. I remember Jen and I climbed the 14ers, and we were on one Uncompahgre, I think it was. And we climbed 5 or 6 hours up. We were right at the top, looking down, and we saw what looked like a little red dot and a little blue dot. And they seemed to be moving, and we were thinking, what could those be? And did somebody drop some litter? No, it's big. Is it an animal? I don't know any red and blue animals. Is it a Democrat, Republican? Maybe so. And sure enough, it was these hikers, but they were way down there and we were way up here. And we could see clouds coming that they couldn't see. And by the time they got up to where they're probably going to be hit by lightning and thunder. And that was basically the message that God gave to Job. You have no idea. Your perspective is way down there. You can only see what's around you. And let me show you what it's like up here, the trillion galaxy God. And then he gives him this tour of the universe. And the whole point is, but Job, you barely hung in there, but you did hang in there. And so here are these theologian friends who have all these explanations of why these things happen to you. I won't even listen to their prayers unless they pray through you, because what you did matters. Because every choice for good. You know, I see all of human history as C.S. Lewis uses the phrase about the planet is a good world spoiled. It shows all the characteristics of a good world, wildflowers, animals, Breckenridge, that's been spoiled, pine beetles, you know, stuff like that. And there are two power streams at work going on, cosmic power streams. One power stream tries to take all the good things and turn them into bad. So all the things we think are good, food is good. Can you misuse food? Can you abuse it? Yes. Sex is good. Can you abuse sex? Oh, yes. Alcohol, take your pick, you know. Government is good. Pave roads, fly planes, things like that. Is government ever bad? Oh, yes. So that's that power stream. And we are recruited as followers of Jesus to be the opposite kind of power stream, to take things that have been corrupted and destroyed, poverty and injustice and racism and all these things, and to correct them, to redeem them in some way. And I believe that power stream matters now. Yeah, otherwise it's just easy to pull up the moat, hide behind the castle, and wait till the next life, you know.
I have a question from your memoirs. You described growing up in a racist church culture, and you said that you were racist, and sounded like you acted out that way, I guess, towards people, whatever. I don't know what it meant for you, but I just was wondering if you could say what it was like in your life moving from that enculturation, which clearly a lot of people in our country are enculturated in that. I'm just interested in how you moved from it.
Well, the biggest revelation to me, I tell the story of a scene at the Christian camp where I was, a man named Peter Ruckman, and he came and spoke. I don't know if you've ever heard this phrase, the curse of Ham. It's a weird deal, but it was actually started by Jews back in the Middle Ages to kind of justify slavery. And then African and Arab slavers used it as well, because they believe in the Old Testament too, Muslims. And Noah, after surviving the flood, you know, he's pretty exhausted, so he gets drunk, like a lot of us after stressful situations. And something weird happens in chapter 9, and it's obviously not really telling you the whole story, because a couple of his sons cover his nakedness up, but one of them doesn't cover his nakedness. So who knows what's going on? I'm glad they didn't tell on it. We really didn't want those details. And so Noah, not God, Noah curses not Canaan, not one of his sons, but Canaan's son Ham. No, the other way around. It was Canaan, the grandson. Sorry, take a look at later about Genesis 9. Canaan is the grandson, and Canaan did the indiscretion, whatever it was. And so Noah, not God, cursed Ham, the father, who didn't do it, which is kind of strange. Well, supposedly the Hebrew word Ham means burnt black, and there's some scholarly support for that. So people took that, and the curse was that Ham will serve in the tents of Shem and Japheth, his brothers. And so this preacher, is demonstrating this, and he says what that means is that people of color can never rise above a certain social stature. You can never see one to be a CEO. You can never see one to be a doctor. He's teaching us this. No one could never be a president of the United States. Oh yeah, just wait. And he actually acted out. Have you ever noticed how good waiters they make? You know, because they could hold trays like this and go around and everybody's kind of laughing. And then I looked over and there was a cook, an African-American cook that I had befriended. And she was refilling the salt and pepper and probably heard the whole thing. And I mean, I was a kid, I was 14, 15. You believe what your parents tell you and what your church tells you. And I believed that too. And later I found out how abominable the theory was. But then a couple of years later, when I was in high school, I got a fellowship at CDC. It was called the Communicable Disease Center then. And I knew that my supervisor was a biologist, who's a chemistry person, biochemistry, who specialized in a particular kind of dye of bacteria. And I tried to read up to impress him about how I knew about dyes of bacteria. Yeah, right, me sophomore in high school. And went to CDC, this massive institution, the first day where Tony Fauci used to work. And went in and they escorted me in, gave me a name tag deal with my picture on it, opened the door and Dr. Cherry was there and it was a Black man. And that was a huge crisis of faith for me because I realized my church had lied to me. My church had told me that this was impossible, that he couldn't rise to that. And so that was really what started my questioning everything, because it was so stark. How did I overcome it? Well, in those days in Atlanta, there wasn't much mixture of the races. And then I went to a Bible college that had one Black student, one from Puerto Rico, who made them roommates. And then fortunately we moved into downtown Chicago. Wheaton didn't help much, but Chicago did. And we went to a church that had a very good mixture. About probably a third of the people there were people of color of some sort. And so much is just being around people of a different culture and understanding the cultural aspects and just being enriched and having friends. Evergreen is not a good place for that either. I know it doesn't look like Breckenridge is a good place for that either. But things are different when you're playing basketball or in the military, or when you're just sharing life experiences and you realize these are human beings and they may have different tastes in this or that than I do. Just like if I go to any foreign country, I run into those differences. So much of it is culture. It's not race. I didn't understand that as a kid growing up. When you look back at the South, I was in Georgia, the laws were were clearly stricter based on the percentage of Blacks. So Georgia had about 33% Black, something like that. Our laws are pretty strict. Alabama had over 40%, much stricter, much more overt racism, much meaner. Mississippi had like 45%, really strict, really strict. It's because of fear, because they could take over. They could be governors, they could rule us, they could do to us like we did to them. That's the fear. But I read books, how to be an anti-racist. There are a lot of books out there teaching us, people who know a lot more than I do. Yes.
I admittedly haven't read your memoir, but I do have $10.
Oh, good.
That's sort of that was not John's question. I did read your Atlantic article, which I thought was really good, that came out last November. And I'm curious what trends and feedback you received from the book and that article. And I can't say I'm familiar with your breadth of writing, but if this last memoir was the most sort of contentious in terms of more traditional faith within the Christian community and how that response has been.
Right. What I wanted to happened with the memoir, I wanted it to reach, there were probably 25 to 30 million ex-evangelicals out there. And these would be mostly younger people who were raised in an evangelical environment. So maybe they went to Young Life, maybe they went to a summer camp. And they probably have some good memories, kind of wistful memories, you know, sitting around singing Kumbaya on the fire and all that. And yet they went to university and something really triggered an adverse reaction. Either professors made fun of them, or they ran into anti-science feelings, or the way gay people or divorced people or whatever people were treated in their church, you know, and it just offended their tolerance. And because with those people, you know, they tend to blame the church. And my response to them when I talk to them is, oh man, it's a lot worse than that. Let me tell you my story. And they say, wait a minute, I thought you were a Christian writer. I say, well, yeah, I am, but it would be a bad trade if you really do believe in a God, to have an opportunity to have a direct relationship, direct access to that God, to trade that away because of the way some old lady treated your gay cousin, you know, that's a bad trade. So let's peel away what's worth keeping and what's worth discarding. And I've been doing, that's what I do, am I right? I hoped, I went to a New York publisher, a different publisher than I've used before, to reach that group. Turns out they're actually hard to reach. You know, there aren't TV programs devoted to ex-evangelicals that you can advertise on. You know, they wouldn't go in a Christian bookstore. So how do you get to them? You can get to them on podcast. I've done things like I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. There is a podcast by that name. And instead, I've gotten a lot of responses from people who ended up telling me their stories. It's not exactly like mine. It's not maybe as extreme as mine, but somehow my story, trying to tell it in specific details, triggers memories in their own story, and they tend to write me about it. And so these are people raised in the church, probably still in the church, and they really I haven't had anybody who's really mad at me because of things I said. I was worried about that. My family's another story, but the church people aren't really mad at me, which is nice. But I didn't really write it for them, and I hope maybe they will be a conduit to get it to the people in their family who gave up. I'd rather encounter like this. I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist was an interesting experience. It's actually Australia. That particular deal was an Australia podcast, and these two people said, "We will read your book. We will be fair to you. We're not going to make fun of you. It's not that kind of podcast. But we're not believers ourselves. We were raised in it. We were fundamentalists first, then evangelicals. Now we're agnostics. But we will be fair." And they went on, and they couldn't have been kinder in promoting the book. They said, "We read this. We looked all the way through for trigger warnings, and we didn't find any. So those of you who are like us, you don't believe, it's okay. It's not going to shake your unbelief." He's not trying to talk you into something. He's just telling a story. And it's a story that you probably share parts of. So I appreciated that. That's what I wanted to accomplish. How much time do we have? What is it? Not much. Okay, 2 minutes. One more question. Yeah, back here.
You want to get there. Two things. The first you talked about, you said at one point you said you kind of alluded to each of us having our own experience being this like individual reality, etc. But then what do you do if everybody's just able to create their own thing? There's no whatever, and that's just chaos. And I did have a thought with that, which was just you'd mentioned the Genesis stuff earlier. But when you think bigger about the Genesis stuff, that there's this idea of the spirit hovering over the chaos and calling light. But as people were really uncomfortable
letting God call light out of chaos, it seems we'd much rather have some kind of structure,
Hmm.
some kind of pattern that we can point to and say, this is how it is. And when I think of the stories of Jesus, he's often tearing down the structures.
You bet.
And when I think of the large majority of people who would say they follow Jesus now, they think their story is to defend some structure. And we find ourselves in really weird places because of that.
Mm-hmm.
So taking all of that into account, when you talk about questioning, and you seem very driven by questions to me, what do you do, personally you, what do you do when the questions so often are driven by the structures that are existing, that, at least from my perspective, would probably be the things Jesus would be tearing down at this point?
Yeah.
And when somebody's giving, often because of those structures drive the questions may not even really be coming from them, they're given to you, which is almost like an affront to the reality of you as an individual experience in the world. Does this make any sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. You're absolutely right about when I wrote the books of Jesus I never knew. I studied the Pharisees and I thought, you know, I had read Jesus' comments on the Pharisees, and he's really fierce. He just goes after them. Nowhere do you see Jesus more angry than when I studied them, he was closer to them in terms of belief systems than any other group. He was almost a Pharisee, and yet the structure got in the way, and they concretized everything, and they hung around other Pharisees all day. They worried about making themselves pure, not making other people cared for. And I'm not anti-institution, but I'm sure glad I'm not part of an institution. I've never had a board. I've never had to raise money. I don't report to anybody, so I'm a freelancer, which means I work for anybody. But the institution takes something like same-sex ordination or same-sex marriage. I can be really loose and say, I don't know. I just know how to treat people. But if you're the head of a denomination, you can't do that. You know, like Calvin College, just this last week, Calvin University went through that. They had this professor who performed a same-sex marriage, and they're part of the Christian Reformed Church, so they got in trouble. And so they spun off that department and made it a completely separate department to please their donors, but it made people mad on both sides, you know? And what's the answer there? I don't know. I just don't know. We have to have institutions, like an educational institution. And who do you marry? Who do you not marry? Where do you draw the line? It's just that Christians have drawn the line in some really weird places over the years. So we need to be very careful when we draw those lines. And I wouldn't be a good institutional person to do that. I like to kind of stand outside and throw little rocks. Little pebbles.
So can I prompt you on two things?
Yeah.
Please. One is recommending the BioLogos organization for those creation science balances.
Right, biologos.org. It's a wonderful outfit. Francis Collins, National Institutes of Health, founded it because every day he gets letters from kids in college who are raised in evangelical homes and are hearing it's nonsense, and he's responding.
And then C.S. Lewis's quote, when we say our first step into heaven, and what
Yeah.
we'll say.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis said our first words when we step into heaven is, oh, I get it. Even dark matter. Let me say a quick prayer. Gracious God, I hope people don't walk away from here just thinking everything's up in the air and it's all a big question mark, because it's not. We stand on We stand in amazement at the Hubble Space Telescope, God, and your power, your majesty, but more your humility, your willingness to, as Philippians 2 says, leave behind the prerogatives of God and come and become one of us little ants down here to prove your love. May we not miss that message, the most important message of all, that you created us because you do love, you are love, and you want us to feel and experience that love. And it's full of grace and all of these things that tax our minds. They just show how little we know. And we do believe that someday all will be well and all shall be well. And we'll get it. And we thank you for that. Amen.